Hello to everyone, and welcome to the continuation of the historical development of the English novel. In previous sessions, we tried to place the earliest English novels in a wider historical context. We talked about the rising of capitalism in the 18th century England. We talked about the explosion of the urban population in the 18th and 19th centuries, and we used Samuel Richardson's Pamela as a way of investigating some of the class tensions and conflicts that seem to have been characteristic of this period. In this session, we are going to refine our thinking about the relationship between history and literature by attending to several complications. And the first of those complications is the fact that historical situation in the middle of the 18th century prompted not only a single response, but actually a wide variety of responses. And that sort of variety is certainly evident in the striking contrast between Samuel Richardson, who was born in 1689 and died in 1761, and Henry Fielding, born in 1707 and died in 1774, two of the great masters of the novel form. As I suggested last time, comparisons between Richardson and Fielding are commonplace. Indeed, those comparisons are almost inevitable since both of them produced their material in the 1740s, and since both of them imagined and presented themselves as rivals. Richardson is the author not only of Pamela from 1740, but also of Clarissa, which appeared in 1747, 1749, an even more ambitious and controversial work. Clarissa may be the longest novel in the English language. A recent paperback edition is 1,500 pages long, very small type letter. Unlike Pamela, Clarissa does not have a happy ending. We have the same basic situation in Clarissa. We have a man pursuing a woman who wants to maintain her virtue, but in this case, the man succeeds in raping the heroine, and she dies more or less as the consequence of that act. This makes Clarissa one of a handful, and I mean a handful, of English novels from the 18th century with a kind of tragic shape. In the previous sessions, we have acknowledged the importance of comedic endings and comedic attitudes of English fiction. Clarissa is the great exception, at least in the 18th century. So that gives us a sense of who Richardson is. Fielding, the author of two great novels, Joseph Andrews from 1742, which is a kind of unauthorized sequel to Pamela. Joseph Andrews is supposed to be Pamela's brother. Her name is Pamela Andrews. And Tom Jones from 1749, which is universally regarded as Fielding's masterpiece. Fielding's great novel begins with the discovery of an infant boy, later named Tom Jones, in the bed of a country gentleman. The aim of this story is twofold. First, we need to discover the truth of Tom Jones. Who are his parents? Where does he fit in society? Who he really is? Orphans turn up over and over again in English fiction. You probably recall a number of examples in Charles Dickens, and one reason for their popularity is the fact that they are so mysterious, not just for personal reasons, but for social reasons as well. We can't quite figure out where they fit in the social hierarchy. So that's the first of the major aims of the story. The second major aim of Tom Jones is to trace the moral development of Tom Jones, the changes that take place in his character and in his behavior over the course of this story. At the beginning of the story, Tom is very good natured. Everyone likes Tom. Almost everyone loves Tom, as a matter of fact, but he lacks prudence. He's a little reckless. He often does things without thinking them through. He enjoys drinking a bit too much. He enjoys, ladies, maybe a little bit too much. And he gets into troubles as a consequence of these and other faults. As Tom's journey through the English countryside and then into London, he succumbs to many temptations, but by the end, Tom has realized his mistakes and won heart of the beautiful and virtuous Sophie Western. He has also been identified as the nephew of a gentleman at whose bed he was first discovered. So at the end of the story, all of the mysteries are resolved. We know exactly who he is, and we know why he deserves uh, to be rewarded so handsomely. Richardson and Fielding are in many ways polar opposites, and here we'll attempt a kind of biological sketch of each author, starting with Richardson, who is the perfect representative of the rising middle class, the son of a cabin maker. We think he has little formal education. We don't know for sure, but he is apprenticed to a printer at the age of 17. By his early 30s, Richardson is running his own very successful printing business. By his late 40s, he is publishing his own writing and assembling his own literary salon. So he's nothing if not a poorly marble. And when Pamela becomes a commercial success, he also becomes a target of considerable abuse. According to his critics, chief among them being Fielding, Richardson is graceless, priggish, and ultimately hypocritical. His heroine may insist on preserving her virtues, but her real aim is wealth and social advancement. In striking contrast with Richardson, Fielding appears almost aristocratic. He is confident of his literary abilities and social skills, and he certainly has reason to be confident. His family connections were excellent, and he enjoyed the benefit of a splendid classical education in Britain. His writings are filled with classical allusions and are designed to give the impression that he is a gentleman. To give you a sense of his typical self-presentation, I like to examine a passage from Tom Jones in which the narrator lists the essential qualities of a good writer or historian. On the narrator list, in addition to talent and worldly experience, is learning. Here's the passage. Invention and judgment are not sufficient for our purpose without a good share of learning. Now, let's stop there and consider the way he introduces this argument, the way he sets up this idea. He starts by talking about invention and judgment. What does he have in mind there? Well, by invention, he simply means creativity, the ability to imagine interesting situations, to imagine interesting characters. Now, judgment, that has to do, I think, with general intelligence, an ability to see what might happen if the reader were to encounter such a situation or encounter such a character. Invention and judgment. Now, he goes on to say that these two things, though very important, though necessary to the great writer, are not sufficient. That it also takes a good share of learning. And about that phrase, we might also ask some questions. What kind of learning does he have in mind? What kind of learning counts in the middle of the 18th century? Well, we have to, in answering that question, set aside our own notions of liberal education, because he's not talking here about natural or social sciences, economy, political. He's not talking about anything of that kind, really. He's talking about classical literature and the history of ancient Greece and Rome. This is what he has in mind. You can't be a great writer, this is what he's saying, no matter how inventive you are, no matter how creative you are, if you don't know the Greeks, if you don't know how the Greeks and the Romans did it, if you're not familiar with the precedent established by Homer, by Virgil, by all of the other classical writers. So with that in mind, let's move through the rest of the passage. I will go right back again so you can see where we are going. Invention and judgment are not sufficient for our purpose without a good share of learning, for which I could again cite the authority of Horace and of many others, if any was necessary to prove that tools are of no service to a workman when they are not sharpened by art, or when he wants rules to direct him in his work, or hath no matter to work upon. Now, there are a couple of interesting things to point out here. First, in substantiating his claim that classical learning is very important, he turns to classical writer. He turns to Horace, and in so doing suggests that he is not inventing anything new in this passage. He is simply repeating, restating a bit in a different way the sort of received wisdom that's been passed down to him from the ancient writers. So that's the first interesting thing to see. The second interesting thing to see is that his image of a writer is actually a kind of homely and common one. The workman, the man who builds a house, that's the person to whom the writer, the author, the creative genius is compared to. I will continue with this session in the next video.